Good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, and our presentation is Life Along the Merrimack. On this podcast, we're going to do something a little different. We always discuss history and health of the Merrimack River, and we generally have a guest. Today, though, I'm going to share with you a news summary about what's happening on the river. There is good news. And I put this together. I'm a career journalist. Also, I know a lot of residents in the area are concerned that the river seems to be getting dirtier, not cleaner. But I'm on top of a couple things, and there's good news in numerous areas. We know that because of heavy rains, rainwater mixes with sewage at wastewater treatment plants. The result is that millions of gallons of sewage is discharged into the river. All this is created by climate change. We're getting more rain and in greater bursts than we have in the past. And more than a dozen sewage treatment plants on the Merrimack River are having problems. But, as I say, that is a bad situation. What is a good situation, it will take billions of dollars to rectify over the years, but things are starting to happen in a positive way. There are half a dozen environmental groups in Newburyport alone that are seeking legislative action to generate money for improvements. It isn't enough to say President Trump does not support environmental improvements or that the Environmental Protection Agency is unable to help. Many citizens in the Merrimack Valley are organizing for improvements. Okay, heartening news item number one. Congressional Representative Lori Trahan of Lowell and Seth Moulton, who represents Newburyport and much of the North Shore, have joined together to request $500 million to start a project leading to improvements. Now, I did not know this. In my travels, when I talk to people, they say, well, there's no money, there's very little chance of making these expensive improvements. But local Congress people have put in a request for $500 million. It's part of a large bill. It doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it is evidence that local Congress representatives are doing something. And I am actually going to read the press release that came from Lori Trahan's office. Again, you know, she represents Lowell and Lawrence. She knows a lot about this issue. In fact, this summer she's taking a canoe trip down the Merrimack with Dan Gravick. Now, he was on the show a couple weeks ago. He's a great kayaker, and she is going to go down the Merrimack River to bring attention to the problems of pollution on the river. And so her heart seems to be into it. Her paddle is going to be into it. So she's an early star for this local area. And so I will read part of the press release. Congresswoman Lori Trahan and Representative Seth Moulton have made a request of $500 million to extend a bill that aids sewage treatment plants. And the appropriation request is seeking that amount for a program to award federal grants to states and municipalities for the planning, design, and construction for combined sewer overflows, sanitary sewer overflows, or stormwater management. Combined sewer overflows are a product of combined sewer systems, as we just said, which are used by more than 800 communities across the nation. So they are looking for a good amount of money to start separating some of the sewerage systems in big areas like Lowell, Lawrence, and Haverhill. Now, Congressman Moulton recently said, the Merrimack River provides our region with clean drinking water and is part of a maritime ecosystem that supports thousands of jobs through fishing and tourism, Moulton said. When sewage flows in the river, it threatens our jobs and our families. This funding is a vital step forward and one of many steps that we'll be taking in the coming weeks. For too long, leaders in Washington have ignored this problem. It's time to fix our aging infrastructure, and so people across the country don't have to worry about the safety of their drinking water. So that is really good. For a while, I was losing heart about Congressman Moulton. You know, you see him on the news in Iowa or South Carolina, and I'm kind of saying to myself, hey, we need you back here. We have a big problem with the river. We love South Carolina, the low country, but if you're in South Carolina or Iowa, which doesn't have many rivers at all, then that doesn't help. You want to be president, but, you know, help us also. Congresswoman Trahan said, the Merrimack River is a vital resource for residents of Massachusetts, and it supplies drinking water to nearly 600,000 people. That makes it all the more alarming that last year, 800 million gallons of sewage and untreated waste were released into the river. The federal government has an obligation to help municipalities like Lowell, Lawrence, Haverhill, and Manchester, New Hampshire to make urgently needed upgrades and to prevent this sort of pollution from jeopardizing the health and economic well-being of people in the region. And I think we all know that if the river gets really dirty and full of sewage, one of our great new industries, which is tourism, will have a hard time surviving. In the last decade, recreational boating has returned to the Merrimack. In fact, there are 1,500 pleasure boats registered on the Newbury side alone. And of course, Amesbury, Salisbury, other communities have boats as well. And we get hundreds every weekend on Cashman Park. So we know that the river is a vital resource. It's a vital asset in most of our lives. And this is another reason why it is important to follow these events, and certainly funding is important for the future. Also a good thing, now this is good item number 2, there has been a bill created to develop the Merrimack River District Commission. Now I know that sometimes it seems disappointing that elements of bureaucracy are always discussed and brought into play. But in order to get federal money or state money or just movement on new programs, you need some kind of bureaucracy and some kind of political force. So local Senator Diana DiZoglio of Methuen has co-sponsored a bill along with State Representative James Kelcourse of Amesbury and several others to create the Merrimack River District Commission. This will, the job of the commission would be to review the state health of the Merrimack River and its tributaries in order to improve and restore water quality. And this is what we need. It's an important element. It will bring people together. They'll probably, write a letter in support of that $500 million funding program. Their bill, which is on the state level, said, our bill will address the issues of pollution in the Merrimack River in order to make the river as clean as possible so the public can use and enjoy it. There will be a plan and more recommendations when the commission is actually put into place. In addition, DiZoglio said her bill will look into ways to protect the public from hazards such as combined sewer overflows, which we just talked about. So different groups would come together, including the Department of Environmental Protection, the Merrimack River Planning Commission, the Massachusetts Management Agency, and the Department of Public Health. Again, it is bureaucracy, but this is the way it has to be done. She said the bill would also allow mayors and town managers along the Merrimack to designate a member for their commission, including one each from the Merrimack River Watershed Council, the Save the Harbor, Save the Bay Commission, the Environmental League of Massachusetts, the Conservation Law Fund, the Sierra Club, the Massachusetts River Alliance, and the Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation at the University of Massachusetts Lowell to assess the emerging technology. And again, it looks like a momentum is building. I went to a meeting about a week ago out on Plum Island at the Refuge Center. There's a 200-seat auditorium there, and this was a discussion by John McCone, who is the acting director of the Watershed Alliance, And there were 200 people there. Every seat was taken. I had to sit on the floor. I mean, I'm committed, but I sat on the floor nevertheless and didn't make a complaint. It was full. And it shows to me that a great many people are concerned about pollution and also in love with the river, and they want it to be better. Now, just on this rather random topic, there was a fellow from Portland, Maine, who came down and said, one thing that we did in Portland, Maine, we had the same problem with rainwater getting into the sewage, and it would go into Casco Bay. So we invoked what they called a rain tax, and that meant that each year, based on the amount of rain, homeowners would be assessed a small amount with the view of collecting money so that eventually they could do planning for improvement. Eventually they could apply for grants for improvement. In other words, they recognized that this was a serious problem and it wasn't going to get done by itself. So at the event, he remarked that, at first a lot of people thought, oh, it's another tax. But he said that, once the word got out there, people realized it wasn't going to happen for free. And if improvements were going to be made, it would take some money. And of course, they don't have the billions to make improvements, but it appears that this rain tax, as they called it, is generating money for planning, for applying for grants, and is now considered part of the environment there. Now, on the subject of meetings, there's also a big meeting Friday, the 7th. This is Tuesday, June 4th. But pursuant to what we're discussing, there is a meeting, a first meeting, the Merrimack River Task Force kickoff meeting, Friday at Northern Essex Community College Technology Center. That's room 103, A and B, from 10 to noon. And that, to me, is another example of people getting religion, deciding that they've got to do something, and many officials from state, city, and regional offices are trying to develop a plan for improvement. Only several months ago, we lamented that nothing was being done. But this is going to be a meeting where many people come together. Mayor Donna Holliday of Newburyport is going to be there, I understand. State and elected officials will be there. And so it's another example of how folks are trying to come to grips with this pollution problem. I remember, and it's a difficult problem. It's going to take a moment to fix. But I remember in the old days, I was a reporter with the Portland Press Herald in Maine, and he had been governor, Senator Ed Muskie got a hold of an idea called the Clean Water Act. This was in the early 70s, and he wanted to generate billions to clean up rivers, the Androscoggin and the Kennebec in Maine, but also the Merrimack right here in Massachusetts. Senator Ted Kennedy was also a part of that. And Muskie, I remember, he got so much pushback and so much hate mail emanating, the opposition was emanating from paper companies upstream and mills upstream. And, they said, we've been doing this for 100 years. If we have to put in all this hardware to clean up the water and make the river clean, we'll all go out of business. And we'll all take the jobs with us. Now, in Maine, this is not an empty threat, because if you don't have a job in Maine, it can be a long winter. Beyond that, there aren't many jobs in Maine. So if you're talking about Westbrook or Millinocket or many communities upriver, they're rural, they're in the woods, and if you don't have a job, it's a bad thing. But Muskie was able to prevail. It's one of the signature events of his career, and the Merrimack benefited very much. I think if you talk to people who knew the river in the 50s and 60s here, the Merrimack River was very dirty. In fact, my tennis doubles partner, Dick Canepa, who grew up here, said his mother refused to let him go near the river because she felt if he fell in, he'd be at the Anna Jakes the next day with sores and lesions. And so a lot of young people stayed away from the river. There weren't that many boaters there for the same reason. And fishing had fallen to quite a low level. Because of the Clean Water Act in the 70s, which was re-upped in 1986 when Senator George Mitchell from Maine was in Washington, and Ted Kennedy was still there as well, an adequate amount of money was brought forth to continue improvements. And so it can be done, and perhaps that's where we are now, that a big effort has to be made. Many different factions have to come together, and that's going to happen on Friday. Again, that's Northern Essex Community College in Haverhill, and I plan to be there. And I used to be a journalist, forever, and I like to go to these things, and particularly now that we have the podcast, now that there's growing interest in cleaning the river, I'm looking forward to that, and I'll report back in a little while. Also here in Newburyport on the Merrimack River, this week is the arrival and presence of the Santa Maria, a modern replica of Christopher Columbus's ship. It's down at the waterfront park right now. It came in on Saturday, and it's open for tours. There are a lot of kids activities down there. In fact, on Saturday, when it came in, there were numerous different things to do, and it was just full of young people, and by young, I'm thinking age 1 to age 15, as well as adults. There are tours. People can go on the vessel, and it's really quite interesting. Several years ago, El Galeon came into the Newburyport Harbor and stayed at Waterfront Park. And the harbor here in Newburyport, as you might know if you're a boater, is very shallow, and sandbars come up when you least expect them. In addition, we have a very strong current from the Merrimack River. We have a big tide at certain times, and so frequently it is very shallow when boats want to come in. 16 feet is the low end of it. So if you're drawing more than 16 feet, you're going to have trouble getting into the harbor. And I remember several years ago, when El Galeon came in, it got to the area about 2 in the afternoon, and there are many young people on the beach. There were many families that came down to watch it, but it kept tacking outside of the harbor, and people were wondering, why don't they just come in? And later, as I say, I was a journalist. I was with the Daily News. I interviewed the captain, who was a 42-year-old lady. At the time, she was the only woman captain in the international tall ship fleet. And she said, this is a very shallow opening to your harbor. I did not want to run aground because I knew if anything went wrong, and I got caught on that sandbar, there'd be photos taken that would go around the world, including to my employers. The vessel would have to wait another cycle of tides before it was able to go. And so I waited till the absolute high tide and a moment when I felt sure I could get through. And the same thing happened this year with the Santa Maria. It was supposed to come in on Friday. Well, it had bad weather at the Cape Cod Canal. It was a little slowed down by that. But then what it found is it missed the tide. So it waited almost a full day to come in, and came in at midnight. Nothing happened, but it must be harrowing to come in a shallow harbor at midnight. Now, they have great technology. I mean, the vessels look old, but they're not old, and they have the best technology. So the captain could see the bottom of the river and could see a lot out front, but still it must be a harrowing moment to come in at almost midnight in the dark with the tide behind you, the river's coming at you, but they made it. Another element I would mention on the waterfront here in town is what's called a First Friday social event at the Maritime Museum down on the waterfront. This happens the first Friday of each month. It's for members only, but membership is not expensive. And this year they're having, because the ship is there, they're having a big tent, and the crew from the Santa Maria will be there. There'll be a couple short speeches. There'll be refreshments. And if you're interested in joining the Maritime Museum, this might be a good time to come down. It's from 6 to 8 at the Maritime Museum on Water Street, and I think it should be a good event. The crew will be there. The crew is bilingual, and to some degree they're inculcated in show business. I mean, they're there to be friendly. They're there to be pleasant. They're there to answer stupid questions, and or good questions. But they're congenial. So as I say, if you're interested in learning more about the museum, if you're interested in learning more about the vessel itself, please go down there. And one thing I also wanted to mention, Newburyport is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. This is one of my missions in life at this point. A lot of people don't know what a big role the Coast Guard has had in the life of Newburyport. In 1790, the first vessel was built for the Coast Guard. It was called the Massachusetts. And since then, at that time, President Washington said to Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, we need more money in the Treasury. Can you come up with an idea? So Hamilton said, yes, I grew up in the West Indies. We have had trade there as long as I've been around. And why don't we have some revenue cutters built? They can go out into the harbors. Number one, they'll cut down on smuggling, so people will be paying their dues or paying their excise to come into the harbor. And secondly, they will go up on the ship and check the cargo to make sure that all the duties are being paid. And so Washington approved 10 vessels. The Massachusetts was the first. It was 60 feet long. And we must remember that the Coast Guard wasn't called the Coast Guard then. It was the Revenue Cutter Service starting in 1790 here in Newburyport. The Humane Society was a different element of waterfront aid, and they became the Life Saving Society. And in 1915, the Marine Revenue Service and the Life Saving Society merged to make the Coast Guard. So the word Coast Guard wasn't formally in our vernacular until 1915. In 1939, the Lighthouse Commission was added to these two, and thus we have the Coast Guard of today. And so we have, there are about 26 Coast Guard stations in New England. There used to be many more, of course, and about 95 nationwide. And I know these things because I've written a book. I'm a frustrated author to some degree. The book is titled New England Coast Guard Stories, Remarkable Mariners. It's all finished with the History Press in Charleston, South Carolina, but it has not come out yet. So I try not to be frustrated. It's coming out in January of all times. Misses a tourist season, misses Christmas, but so be it. It's going to be coming out. But that was, a great endeavor. And I must say, one of the funny things, the name of the book was originally New England Coast Guard Stories, Remarkable Patriots. But the marketing department saw that. They did a little Googling, and they came back and said, you can't use Remarkable Patriots. And so I said, why not? They're great patriots. And they said, well, every time anyone Googles New England and Patriots in the same line, they get the New England Patriots football team, which makes complete sense. And it would be poor form if my book comes out, someone Googles the book, and they can't find it until the 19th page, and it's the 217th item listed under under Patriots. So I gave them that one. Now they've gone from remarkable Patriots to remarkable Mariners. But it was great fun to do that. Last summer, I went from northern Maine to southern Connecticut, and at that time I interviewed many individuals who are in the Coast Guard. There are about 42,000 people, men and women, in the active Coast Guard. There are about 24,000 in the auxiliary. We have an auxiliary here in Newburyport. There's about 7,000 in the Coast Guard Reserve. Now that is a little different. That means you can have another job, but if you're called to do that, you have to leave your job and go where the Coast Guard sends you. So it's been, a big significant project to do that. I interviewed about 20 different individuals in the Coast Guard, because one of my things is, you've read a lot of books, and many of them are academic. But half of this book, New England Coast Guard Stories, is about individuals in the Coast Guard. Why did you join? What have you found there? Is this a good place to be? Would you recommend it to someone? So I will have about half interviews in the book. And about more than half my interviews are of women, because I've never seen a book on a military subject that referenced women, other than to say they're the first woman to jump out of a chopper or the first woman to serve in a given location. Women talk about their lives, and it's pretty interesting. There are about 6,000 women in the Coast Guard now. We said there are 42,000 total. There are about 6,000 women. And they weren't really accepted until 1976. That was the year that the first women entered the Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut. There were 38 women who started, 14 finished, which, bless them, they were great. But now there are many more women at the Academy. In fact, this last year, almost 40% of the cadets at the Coast Guard Academy were women. So that's, to me, a remarkable increase. It's a great field. I remember I talked to one woman. She had been in for about 20 years. She was is a commander. And she's had a great career. She started in Hurricane Katrina, if you can imagine that. Did a great job. Has moved up. She's a number 3 in New Haven, which has about 400 coasties. So she's doing very well. So I said, Valerie, you've done very well, but as a journalist, I just have to ask, other than Coast Guard, what have you been doing? You have a terrific record, and everything is going well, but do you have other interests? And she said, well, in the last 10 years, I managed to have 3 little baby girls. They're all doing great, and I'm picking them up at 5:30 today. So I thought that was an amazing moment when women talk about what they do. And she'd done all this. She'd advanced rapidly. She wants to be eventually the commandant of the Coast Guard Academy, which is very impressive. And in the meantime, had 3 children. Now, her husband is in the Coast Guard, and in recent years, the Coast Guard has made an attempt to make it easier on families. If you're being transferred to Alabama or Alaska, they will try to see that your spouse can go too. So this is Dyke Hendrickson. This is Life Along the Merrimack. I just want to end by reading a couple lines that reference the value of the Coast Guard to young people. This came from my recent book, Nautical Newburyport. This is a letter from a new coastie to his officer, petty officer he knew at training when he was at boot camp. Dear Petty Officer Shea, this has been a great experience for me and the hardest thing I've ever done. I look forward to carrying on the training at the fleet level and believe I have been given everything I need to succeed. Very respectfully, Brian Irwin. And my last one is, and I have to do this fast, from a woman. Dear Petty Officer Shea, 8 weeks ago I probably would not be able to say this, but I finished, and you helped me very much. I learned a great deal. I found out I was stronger than I thought I was, and I'm capable of doing much more than I ever thought possible. I am stoked about the future. So that is a little bit about the Coast Guard. I have enjoyed this. I'm Dyke Hendrickson. This is Life Along the Merrimack, and please join us next time. Thank you very much.